Picture this: the jazz was still echoing, champagne glasses still clinking, and cities glowing in neon confidence. The 1920s had convinced America that the good times would never end. People were buying stocks like lottery tickets, radios were piping news into living rooms, and new cars rolled out of factories like candy. But underneath all that shine, the engine was overheating, and no one, absolutely no one, was ready for what came next. Welcome to Irregular Mind and to episode 35 of US History Understanding This Country. I am your host Santosh Janardhanan, still speaking from New Jersey with same thick accent and curious mind that guides us through the centuries of American stories. Last time we danced through the Roaring Twenties, an era of booming cities, consumer frenzies, and cultural revolutions. But today, the music stops. This is the story of the Great Depression, when Wall Street crumbled, breadlines grew, and very idea of American dream was up for a debate. Before we roll further into the turbulent tale, let me take a quick moment to thank you for tuning in. If you have been enjoying the show, do consider rating or following wherever you are listening me. A little tap on the star or subscribe button goes a long way. And hey, if you think someone else in your circle, a curious teen, an old friend, maybe your father in law who always brings up politics, would enjoy this, send it their way. Sharing is how this podcast grows. Alright, let's rewind to 1929 because the crash is coming. It didn't take a bomb or a war to break America's back in 1929, just fear, speculation, and a whole lot of borrowed money. The stock market crash of October 1929 wasn't just a bad day on Wall Street. It was a collapse in slow motion that had been building up through the decade. People had been investing like mad, buying stocks on margin, meaning they borrowed money to buy more than they could actually afford. It worked like magic when the market was going up, but when prices started dipping in early autumn, that magic turned into panic. On October 24th, known forever as a Black Thursday, the first tremor hit. Investors started selling, prices dropped, more people rushed to get out. Brokers called in their loans. But the real implosion came 5 days later on Black Tuesday, when nearly 16 million shares were traded. The market lost billions in value. The ticker tape at New York Stock Exchange fell hours behind. Banks, having thrown their customers' deposit into risky investments, began folding. But here's the thing: the stock market crash didn't cause the Great Depression all by itself. It was just the first domino. What followed was a chain reaction. Factories cut back on production, companies laid off workers, people stopped spending, more business failed, and the spiral deepened. The economy didn't just stumble, it had entered a free fall. By 1930, the crash had turned into a full blown economic catastrophe. Bank failures were rampant. Ordinary people, the same ones who were buying radios and vacuum cleaners on credit just an year earlier, were now standing in breadlines. Farms went bankrupt, families lost their homes, and the unemployment rate kept climbing, eventually hitting nearly 25%. Imagine being a 10-year-old in Chicago or Oklahoma during this time. Your dad might have been a factory worker or a farmer, and suddenly there is no work, no food on the table, and no idea when or if it'll get better. The Great Depression wasn't just a Wall Street story. It seeped into every street, every kitchen, every conversation in America. It was no longer about roaring, it was about surviving. President Herbert Hoover didn't cause the Great Depression, but he sure became the face of it. When the stock market collapsed and banks began to fold, Hoover, who had been elected in 1928 with a reputation as brilliant administrator and humanitarian, suddenly found himself in a position he never could have anticipated. And it showed. Hoover genuinely believed in the American spirit, the idea that individuals, not government, should be the driving force behind recovery. His belief in what he called the rugged individualism meant that he resisted direct federal aid to the unemployed. Instead, he urged private charities, local governments, and businesses to volunteer help. To him, government handouts risked making people dependent and weak. But the problem was, people were already broken. Factories were closed, crops were rotting in the fields, Children were going to bed hungry. Cities were filled with what came to be known as the Hoovervilles, shanty towns of homeless families cobbled together from scrap metal and cardboard. The name wasn't accidental, it was America's way of placing the blame squarely on the president. Then came 1932, the Bonus Army. Over 15,000 World War I veterans, many with families, marched to Washington, D.C. They were demanding early payment of a bonus that had been promised to them for their wartime service, scheduled for 1945. These men were desperate. They had fought for the country and now they were starving. They set up camps near Capitol, holding peaceful demonstrations. But as weeks passed and tensions rose, Hoover, fearing unrest, ordered the US Army to clear them out. What followed was public relations disaster. Tanks rolled down Constitution Avenue, and troops under the command of General Douglas MacArthur used tear gas and bayonets to drive out the veterans. Camps were burned. Images of American soldiers attacking fellow American heroes spread across the country like wildfire. Whatever faith people still had in Hoover's leadership vanished with that smoke. In the eyes of many, this wasn't just bad governance, it was betrayal. A man who once fed Europe during the World War I had now tear gassed his own countrymen. The country was hungry not just for bread, but for a change. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt stepped into the national stage, America was a country on its knees. Banks were failing, breadlines were growing, and faith in the government had hit the rock bottom. But here came a man who radiated calm, confidence, and an almost contagious optimism. FDR wasn't a stranger to hardship. Years before he became president, polio struck him in 1921, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. But he didn't disappear or wallow in self pity. He learned to walk again with braces, crutches, and sheer willpower. That fight became symbolic. If Roosevelt could rise from paralysis, maybe the country could rise from depression. He was elected in 1932 in a landslide victory over Hoover, promising a new deal for the American people. And from the moment he took office, Roosevelt exuded action. While Hoover gave the impression of waiting for things to fix themselves, FDR jumped in headfirst. But what truly set him apart, beyond the policies and programs, was the way he spoke to the people. That's where the fireside chats come in. These weren't your typical presidential speeches. They were simple, clear, and warm. Roosevelt spoke directly to Americans over radio, calling them my friends, and explaining the banking crisis, economic reforms, and the steps his administration was taking, all in a tone that was calm and reassuring. People gathered around their radios like it was a family story hour, not politics. He made the White House feel less like a marble fortress and more like a neighbor's living room. For a nation that had felt ignored, confused, and abandoned, these radio talks were more than communication, they were healing. FDR's charm wasn't just in his words, it was in his ability to make the average American feel seen and heard. That emotional connection, combined with his sweeping actions, helped rebuilding something the Great Depression had nearly wiped out: hope. The first New Deal was Roosevelt's opening act, and he didn't waste a second. Within days of taking office in 1933, he declared a bank holiday, closing every bank in the country for several days. Sounds dramatic, right? But it worked. It stopped the panic. Americans had been lining up to withdraw whatever money they had left, but after FDR's decisive move and a calm explanation on the radio, many actually brought their money back. It was a small but powerful show of restored confidence. Then came the alphabet soup. To deal with mass unemployment, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, or FERA, started pumping money into states to fund emergency relief efforts. It was basic but essential, keeping families fed and sheltered in the worst of times. But Roosevelt knew that people didn't just need food, they need dignity. They needed work. That's where the Civilian Conservation Corps and Public Works Administration stepped in. Young men were sent to plant trees, build parks, fight forest fires, and lay down infrastructure. The Tennessee Valley Authority, or TVA, took it a step further, electrifying one of the poorest regions in the country by building dams and power plants along the Tennessee River. This wasn't just relief, it was transformation. To stabilize the banking system, FDR backed the creation of Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC, which meant People's money in the bank was now insured. If the bank failed, they wouldn't lose their life savings. That one move alone helped ease nationwide paranoia. Then there was the Securities and Exchange Commission, set up to regulate the stock market and prevent the kind of reckless behavior that led to the crash. For farmers who had been drowning in debt and suffering from overproduction, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration or AAA paid them to grow less. The idea was to reduce supply, raise crop prices, and help farmers recover. Controversial? Yes, but effective? Also, yes, at least in the short term. And then there was National Industrial Recovery Act or NIRA, a sweeping attempt to get industries and workers cooperating under fair codes of competition. It aimed to set minimum wages, maximum hours, and give workers the right to unionize. It didn't last long, the Supreme Court struck it down, but it laid the groundwork for future reforms. The first New Deal wasn't just a grand solution, it was a flurry of experiments. Some worked, some didn't. But the message was clear, the government wasn't going to sit this one out. FDR was in the driver's seat, and he was willing to try just about anything to steer the country out of this ditch. If the first New Deal was about immediate relief and economic triage, the second New Deal was Roosevelt digging in, focused on long term change and rewriting the rules of American life. By 1935, it was clear that while things had improved, the crisis wasn't over. Unemployment was still sky high, farms were still in ruins, and workers were still struggling to be heard. So Roosevelt doubled down. The cornerstone of his second wave was Social Security Act of 1935. Until then, there was no such thing as retirement fund for working class Americans. If you got old or disabled and couldn't work, you were on your own, or your family's charity. With Social Security, the government promised regular payments to retired workers and unemployed and the disabled. It was in many ways the birth of modern American safety net, and it's still here, nearly a century later. Alongside that came the Wagner Act, also known as the National Labor Relations Act. This law was a huge win for labor movement. It gave workers the right to organize and form unions, and it created a National Labor Relations Board to oversee disputes. This wasn't just symbolic, this law helped tip the balance back towards the workers after decades of corporate dominance. It didn't end workplace abuse, but it gave people tools to fight back. Then came Works Progress Administration, one of the most ambitious government programs in American history. While earlier programs like CCC focused on young men and manual labor, the WPA cast a wider net. It employed millions, men and women alike, to build roads, bridges, airports, and schools. But here is what made WPA unique. It also employed artists, writers, musicians, and actors. Yes, even in the depth of the Depression, the federal government was paying people to paint murals, write plays, collect oral histories, and document American life. That's the thing about the second New Deal. It wasn't just about getting through the moment, it was about reimagining what government could be. FDR wasn't just managing a crisis anymore, he was shaping a future where security, fairness, and even creativity had a place in national policy. Even with all the bold programs and soaring speeches, the 1930s were still hard, brutally hard. And in some places, nature itself seemed to be pushing people over the edge. In the heart of American plains, from Oklahoma to Kansas to parts of Texas, a perfect storm of bad farming practices and a long, merciless drought created a disaster known as the Dust Bowl. Years of aggressive plowing had stripped away the native grasses that once held the soil in place. So, when the rain stopped and the wind picked up, the topsoil just flew away. Black blizzards of dust swept through the towns, blanketing homes, killing crops, and choking animals and people. Families packed up whatever they could and hit the road, many heading west to California. They were hoping to find some farm work. These Okies, as they were called, often not kindly, became the human face of environmental collapse and economic despair. Meanwhile, in the cities and factories, workers weren't just waiting around for help, they were organizing. Labor had been always stirring before the Depression, but the crisis gave it urgency. People were tired of being treated like disposable parts in someone else's profit machine. The Wagner Act had cracked the door open, and workers pushed through. Sit down strikes, walkouts, union drives, they became part of the national rhythm. In places like Detroit's auto plants and steel mills of Pennsylvania, workers demanded better wages, shorter hours, and safer conditions. This was the rise of organized labor as a force in American politics. Not just blue collar solidarity, but real muscle. These were the roots of the labor unions that would help shape mid century America, giving working people a seat at the table in industries that once saw them as tools. So, even as federal programs tried to lift the country, these years were also about regular people farmers, workers, and migrants pushing back, adapting, and refusing to give up. By the mid 1930s, something seismic had shifted, not just in economy, but in American politics. FDR wasn't just offering relief programs, he was reshaping the political map. The New Deal coalition brought together an unlikely alliance white Southern Democrats, Northern industrial workers, urban immigrants, black voters who had historically supported the Republican Party since Lincoln, and even progressive intellectuals. These groups didn't have much in common on paper, but under FDR's broad umbrella of government action and economic relief, they found a shared cause. It was the beginning of a new democratic majority, one that would dominate American politics for the next several decades. But not everyone was sold on Roosevelt's approach. To someone on the left, he hadn't gone far enough. Figures like Hugh Long pushed for wealth distribution with his share our wealth plan, while others called for even more radical reforms. On the right, critics saw FDR as a would be dictator. Business leaders bristled at regulations. Conservative politicians warned that the government was growing too powerful too fast. Then came the Supreme Court. Several of FDR's most ambitious programs were getting struck down by the court, which still leaned conservative. So Roosevelt, in one of the most controversial moves of his presidency, proposed the court packing plan, a scheme to add more justices to Supreme Court, supposedly to ease the workload, but really to tilt the bench in his favor. It backfired. Even many of his supporters in Congress balked. The proposal didn't pass, but the message was clear. Roosevelt was willing to push hard against limits when he felt the stakes were high. And though the plan failed, over time the course shifted anyway, and many of the New Deal programs survived or evolved. This was more than just political gamesmanship, it was a battle over the future of American governance, how far the federal government should go in shaping people's lives, and how much power one man could wield in the name of national recovery. The answers were murky then, and they still echo in debates today. When the world outside feels bleak, people turned inward or upward. And in 1930s, America turned to stories, musics, and screens to escape the weight of the reality. Hollywood boomed during the Great Depression. That might sound odd. How could folks afford movies when they could barely afford bread? But for just a few cents, you could step into a theater and forget your troubles. People flocked to see Fred Astaire glide across the polished floor or Marx Brothers turn chaos into comedy. Shirley Temple, with her dimples and dances, became beacon of hope for families trying to believe in joy again. The radio too became a lifeline. Entire families would gather in living rooms, tuning into news updates, fireside chats, soap operas, and serialized adventures. These weren't just distractions, they were shared experiences that stitched together a frayed national spirit. FDR's own fireside chats, delivered in that calm, fatherly voice, reassured millions that someone in Washington actually understood them. Books, meanwhile, gave voice to the pain and the resilience of the era. John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath captured the human cost of the Dust Bowl and economic collapse following the Jod family as they trekked west in the search of dignity. It wasn't an easy read, but it was a necessary one, and it struck a chord. And then there was the music. The 1930s gave us swing, music that made your feet move even if your heart was heavy. Big bands, led by likes of Duke Ellington and Benny Goodman, played in dance halls and over the airways. This wasn't just entertainment, it was fuel, a way to stay upright, to shake off the dust, even if just for a night. In the end, escapism wasn't about ignoring hardship, it was a survival tactic, a cultural exhale. While the economy staggered and politics wrestled over solutions, art and storytelling held the country together. reminding people who they were and who they could still be. As the 1930s drew to a close, the clouds of economic despair began to lift, but not entirely because of the New Deal. Despite Roosevelt's sweeping programs and reforms, the economy still limped through much of the decade. Unemployment remained high, and while millions were helping by job programs and aid, it wasn't enough to fully revive the engine of prosperity. Then, almost suddenly, the world shifted. The World War II, though still brewing overseas, would soon pull America into a different kind of mobilization, one that no public works program could match. Defense spending skyrocketed. Factories that had slowed to a crawl now worked around the clock, producing tanks, planes, uniforms, and ammunitions. Unemployment disappeared, not because of alphabet agencies, but because young men went to war and industries desperately needed workers. Women and African Americans, long shut out of many jobs, suddenly found themselves in demand. So, was it the New Deal or the war that ended the Great Depression? The honest answer, a bit of both, but mostly the war. The New Deal softened the blow, stabilizing the economy and, most importantly, redefined what Americans expected from their government. Before the Depression, federal involvement in daily life was minimal. Afterward, the government was seen not just as a referee but as a safety net. Social security, labor rights, banking regulations, all of these became part of the new American compact. The Great Depression didn't just reshape the economy, it redefined the role of the government, shifted political coalitions, empowered the labor movement, and inspired decades of cultural reflection. And just as the country began to breathe again, it would soon be asked to hold its breath once more as the world plunged into the deadliest war yet. And just like that, we have come to the end of another chapter in this long, complicated, and endless fascinating story of America. The Great Depression wasn't just an economic disaster, it was a national reckoning. It exposed the cracks in capitalism, tested the limits of democracy, and forced a once hands off government to roll up its sleeves and get deeply involved in people's lives. Whether through Roosevelt's sweeping reforms or the determined grit of ordinary folks just trying to survive, the 1930s carved deep lines into the soul of the country. But while the dust was just beginning to settle down, storms were brewing overseas. Fascism was on the march in Europe, Japan was expanding in the Pacific, and isolationist America was about to be pulled into the deadliest conflict in human history. That's what we will dive into the next episode, episode number 36, the Second World War. If you have found this episode insightful, interesting, or if it helped paint the picture of a time that still echoes today, I would love your support. Please follow the show on your favorite podcast app, give it a rating, or share it with someone who would enjoy this kind of storytelling. It helps more than you think. Thanks for spending your time with me. Until next time, stay curious and stay kind. Bye.